what I'm seeing is they're taking it out of one of the tributaries of Lake Shasta, off the snow-capped mountain of Mount Shasta. They're taking it out of the bark of trees that have died from aluminum toxicity. This is all, I mean, so blatantly real. I just can't believe that there are skeptics out there that can deny this.
Well, the skeptics usually are people who are involved with government somehow, and that's their job. Their job is to debunk it. The problem is that we have people who are trained biologists who are taking water samples, like you say, from lakes and streams. We have biologists from all over the world that are sampling it from the leaves of trees and plants and the fauna in Hawaii, in the Pacific Northwest, in Arizona. So they're doing it all over. All of them are finding the same things. And, of course, we have records of the levels of aluminum in the lakes and streams and vegetation that go back many, many decades. And so it's easy to compare. And what we see is over the last 10 years has been an astronomical increase in the aluminum, not just a minor variation, but an astronomical increase in the aluminum level. And, when you look at it worldwide and you see the same thing, the skeptics just sort of fade into the world of nonsense. Most of the time when I see skeptics that are questioning what I say, others say, their arguments are so patently ridiculous, it wouldn't even make a good fairy tale. So they're very desperate and bending over backward trying to concoct some nonsense explanation. And one of the defenses I gave, I would watch these chemtrails. My wife and I would watch them, and I looked up and I said, notice that the jet's chemtrail now has stopped, and there's a gap, and then it started again, and then it stopped, and there's another gap. Well, if it's a contrail, that means a jet the size of a B-17 is shutting its engines off and starting them back up.
Yeah,
well,
a little sputter there.
Jets can't shut their engines off and turn them back on repeatedly. That alone proves it's nonsense. They're not turning them on and turn them off within a short distance. And then they give the explanation, it's the coldness of the atmosphere. Well, you can see two jets flying at the same time. They're both large jets. One of them has a normal contrail, very short, very small. The other next to it is a huge trail. And so they're flying at the same time, same atmosphere, same temperature, same elevation, and yet their trails are different. And they're obviously different, tremendously different. And when these chemtrails go over, it produces huge clouds. Well, you don't see contrails that produce persisting clouds.
No, they immediately begin to dissipate.
After the jet is gone. That's sheer nonsense. So, their explanations are laughable nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, contrails, by their very nature, begin to dissipate as soon as they come out of the plane. And what we're seeing here is particles that are remaining intact and spreading. It's patently ridiculous.
Sure, and they form clouds.
Yeah.
We've seen some days in which virtually every cloud in the sky is a chemtrail cloud, and they're there long after the jet's gone. I mean, hours after. They're these huge smudges of clouding. Well, that's not a contrail. Contrails don't last that long. And the other thing that's suspicious is when they try to get the military to let them sample the fuel in these jets. They wouldn't let them do it directly. What they did is they sent them samples of jet fuel. Well, that's two different things.
Yeah.
I want to know what's in that jet fuel. I don't want to have you send me a sample. You go down to the pure tank and send a sample, but you're not taking what's being sprayed into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of secrecy. They don't want sampling. They don't want you on the airplanes, and so you have to question, well, what's all this secrecy about?
Well, and is that how they're doing it? Is adding it to the jet fuel so that it disperses, or and this is something I don't know. Is it a big C-130 or something that's got these huge tanks and the pilots are fully aware of what they're doing?
Well, I would suspect the latter. Even though a lot of the people suspect what's being put in the fuel, I don't think you could put a high enough concentration in the fuel that might interfere with the fuel and ruin the engine. I think there's separate tanks that they're spraying, and some of the photographs I've seen up close of the jets, it looks like separate nozzles. And so, and the size of the cloud coming directly out of the jet is huge. I mean, it's as large as a fuselage. I suspect that they have separate tanks that contain these compounds that are being sprayed.
And, I've heard a lot of people saying, well, you would have a pilot that would finally, turn state's evidence or become a whistleblower or whatever they want to say. But, I mean, we've got pediatricians out there continuing to stick needles into young children left and right over and over again. They really honestly believe they're doing the right thing, and I think that's what we're going to see with this stratospheric engineering, geoengineering, is just the simple fact that these people have been brainwashed into believing that what they're doing is important and good for the environment.
Yeah, that's certainly a strong possibility. Pilots in the military, of course, in the military, they're told what's in those tanks is none of your business.
Right.
That's out of your need to know. And if you've ever been in the military, that's the way things work. Everything's categorized. You have certain information you're allowed, none of your business, and you better not even look into it. So the pilot's just told, spray this, and it's, he may be told it's for geoengineering, but the contents of it he doesn't know. These pilots, they don't know anything about nano-aluminum. They don't know about the neurological effect of aluminum accumulation in the brain. They're just told that this is protecting the environment and preventing a catastrophe. You see, the military's even been told that this supersedes everything else in terms of national security. That global warming is the greatest threat to our national security, which is sheer nonsense.
Why is it that people don't seem to care?
Well, in the 1930s, scientists wondered how Hitler could rule Germany and Stalin could rule Russia. These were vast territories. He could rule with practically no army. And the answer was they had discovered during the 1920s that adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water made the people very passive. Stalin found out that in his concentration camps, where you have to have guards, I mean nobody's there because they want to be, that by adding sodium fluoride to the drinking water to camps, or the gulags, he could reduce his guards by an average of 4. You only need 1 in 4, 25% instead of 100%, which comes to quite a bit of money. Sodium fluoride is a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum, which is a very complicated, well, you have it in Florida. It's a very complicated manufacturing process, and a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum is sodium fluoride, which is a very dangerous chemical and is very expensive to dispose of. So somebody came up with the imaginative premise that maybe sodium fluoride could be used to add to water, and maybe it would help prevent cavities in children in their teeth. There was never any study conducted on this, and no proof whatsoever that this was true, but Congress, with the judicious application of bribes, passed a bill enacting sodium fluoride addition to water supplies all over the United States. And we haven't had a revolution since. And we had one-party government ever since.
Why did America get involved in World War II?
Well, it was inevitable because World War II was simply a rerun of World War I, exactly the same cast of characters. And in fact, it was the same person. The government is always an occupation government, representing somebody else. The government does not represent the American people, because a democracy is supposed to be representative government. Now, Washington today does not represent any American, except in a very tenuous way.
Was 9/11 an inside job?
100%. What I called it publicly, I was quoted in the New York Times after 9/11, I said it's a typical government operation. And I don't know anybody that said it better. And that appeared in the New York Times in the Frank Rich column, and Frank Rich printed it, but he didn't offer any rebuttal.
Is it a United States government job, or is it a Zionist inside job?
Well, it's more a Zionist inside job,
Okay.
because the Zionism is the government in Washington. Everybody knows that.
So the United States government is controlled by Zionists.
Yes. Well, in Congress, have you ever heard any congressman stand up and make a speech denouncing Israel? Well, you won't.
With that said, and these bankers know that, their time could be limited, no
Yeah.
matter how much money they got, what would they be capable of doing?
Well, right now they're capable of staying on top of the current, and they have enough money to buy into anything they want to. So they're trying to keep control. But of course, they have no control over the internet. Anything can come on the internet. And so they're just trying to ride it out. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion are a very debated document which appeared in the 19th century, and supposedly it's a program by which the Zionists were going to take over the world. The techniques that they would use to do this, by controlling communications and education and governments and so forth. And it's a very detailed program for exercising power. And so this document was immediately denounced, and the Zionists denied that it ever existed and so forth. But it was finally brought before a court in Basel, Switzerland, and a judge ruled that the Elders of Protocols of Zion was a forgery. And of course, a forgery is an illegitimate copy, an unauthorized copy of a real document. So the judge's ruling that the Protocols of Elders of Zion was a forgery established that there was a real document somewhere called the Elders of Protocols of Zion, although none was produced. And so ever since then, whenever you mention the Elders of Protocols of Zion, they say, well, that was ruled a forgery by the court in Switzerland. And it was ruled a forgery, which meant that it was a copy of a document that it existed somewhere. I mean, when you forge a check for $100, there has to be an original check somewhere for $100 that you forged. So the Elders of Protocols of Zion is the same thing. The fact that the court ruled that there was such a document meant that there is such a document somewhere and is eventually produced. Henry Ford was the most famous publisher of the Elders of Protocols of Zion, although it's been published in millions of copies ever since 1870. And the reason that Henry Ford published this, as you know, he was an automobile maker, and the fact is he was a very successful manufacturer of automobiles, and because he was so successful, he became the richest man in the world in 1927. The New York Times named him as the richest man in the world. Well, as the richest man in the world, he became fair game, so bankers set about trying to buy control of his stock and control of his company. And he needed capital to expand. He was expanding so rapidly, he needed a lot of capital. He needed hundreds of millions of dollars to keep his motor car company going or to sell it to somebody else. So he tried to borrow the money from Kuhn-Loeb and the Wall Street bankers, and they told him they'd be glad to lend him the money, but they wanted controlling interest. In other words, he had to give away the company. It would no longer be his. So he was very indignant about that because he was a Michigan farmer and he didn't like being robbed. And so he began to publish articles about these the Jewish bankers that tried to rob him. And he made a crusade out of it. He launched a newspaper called the International Jew, which became a series of books, which I think were 9 volumes, which told the background of the Jews as white slavers. They were very active in slavery. They brought slavery to America. And their adventures in alcohol. They were behind the, after Prohibition, they became the biggest liquor manufacturers in the world. Most of it was cheap whiskey, which was cut with raw alcohol, which blinded hundreds of people and killed many thousands more. And it was typical of their operations because killing people wholesale seems to be a get-rich-quick idea that if you can kill thousands of people, you're going to be very rich. My friend Ernst Zundel is in prison today in Germany. He's finally been charged after about 8 years of being in prison before they ever leveled a charge against him. And so the charge is inciting racial hatred. And Ernst Zundel has never been a member of any group which incites racial hatred. So he'll probably never be tried because that's what happened to Ezra Pound. He was imprisoned in St. Elizabeth's under a capital charge of treason, punishable by the death penalty, but they never dared try him because when they called him in and said, Dr. Pound, because he was a doctor of letters from Hamilton College, how do you plan to defend yourselves on these charges? And Ezra said to them, I will stand behind everything that I've ever publicly uttered on politics. And they were devastated because he had too big a reputation, a worldwide reputation, to be tried when he would demolish every argument they came up with. So they got 3 government psychiatrists to testify that he was incompetent to participate in his own defense because he said he'd stand by everything he had said. So these psychiatrists said he was incompetent to participate in his own defense, and they held him in prison for 13.5 years, and I was told on Capitol Hill that he would never be released in his lifetime. I was told that by General Lucius Clay and by Supreme Court Justice Tom Clark and 2 other leading officials in Washington, because I had personal connections with them, and I didn't talk to them myself, but George Simpson, the founder of National Press Club, said, well, I'll ask around about Ezra what his chances are. And he came back and reported to me that they all said he will never be released from St. Elizabeth's in his lifetime. And 8 years later, the government dropped all charges against him, and he walked out a free man.
Why was Ernest Zundel deported?
Well, he was a Holocaust denier. They've called me a Holocaust denier also, although I have never denied there was a Holocaust because I've never even admitted there was one. So,
Do you think there was?
well, there was no Holocaust. You see, Hitler, now I'm the only person that apparently knows this, and I speak about it very freely. In the waning wars of World War II, when the Allies started to bomb Germany very heavily, Hitler moved all of the Jews out of German cities into rural areas in these camps. And so no Jew died during the Allied bombing of Germany. And that was he was holding them as a bargaining tool because he knew he was going to lose the war, so he could negotiate the terms of surrender by the fact that he had saved the Jews from extermination. So now he's known for the fact that he exterminated the Jews.
So the Zionists flipped all this around
Oh, they flip everything around.
in their favor.
For the name hate monger, which they've called me many times, and a hate monger is a person who criticizes Israel. That's all that matters. That's the only definition of a hate monger.
Is there a difference between a Jew and an Israeli?
Oh, no. Because the Jews are the occupants of Israeli. Although the Palestinians lived there, it was originally their land, but they were dispossessed, and so they're not considered as existing. Palestinians have no rights according to Israel.
I think according to Israel, nobody has rights but Jews.
Well, they have a perfect claim because they say God gave them a real estate deed to the property, and which they refuse to show anybody, but it's considered valid.
Are the Jews God's chosen people?
Well, that occurs in the Old Testament. I don't know how often, but the Old Testament also contains many pages of denunciations of the Jews by the God and threats to punish them for their transgressions. It's about 50-50. There's more verbiage in the Old Testament of God denouncing the Jews and threatening the Jews than there is of calling them his chosen people.
Well, what's the difference between a Christian and a Jew?
Theoretically, biologically, we're the same people. We're human beings. Well, the Jewish people, according to my book, The New History of the Jews, the Hebrews got their name from Habiru, Habiru. And Habiru meant bandits in the Old Testament. So these people were known as bandits all over the Middle East. But the Jews have their own book, which is called the Talmud. And in the Talmud, which is the Jewish Bible, they continually denounce Mary as a whore and a prostitute, and Jesus as a madman, and sometimes as a homosexual. And so it's totally anti-Christian. But they've never bothered to explain any of these accusations. But they're rabbis studying this for all their lives, so they apparently conclude that it's absolutely true, and there's no apology for using those terms. And of course, 1 billion Christians who have some belief in Christianity resent this very much about Mary and Jesus being all these foul names. So this is done simply to keep passion stirred up between the various religions.
Is the CIA controlled by Zionists?
Well, my book, The World Order, has the only history of the CIA. I went through at least 6 histories of the CIA, which were between 800 and 1,000 pages apiece. And from that, I got the entire history of the CIA. And I have it all in 10 pages in my book, The World Order. I'm sorry I don't have one with me. But as I say, this so-called friend carried off a copy about a month ago. I told him, I said, this is my print copy. I got to reprint this book. And he said, I'll get it back to you in a week. And I haven't heard from him in 3 weeks.
Tell me about that. How does that start in your book, and where does it go?
Well, I give the entire history of the CIA, which was formed in 1940 in London by the British General Staff. And the chief architect of the CIA, which was established as a branch of the Secret Intelligence Service, SIS of England, which was established by the Bank of England in 1694 and became the best intelligence service in the United States because it had unlimited funds because that was financed by the Bank of England. It was simply a private intelligence agency for the Bank of England, just like the FBI is a private intelligence agency of the Federal Reserve System.